The morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Baltimore as Michael Thompson drove to his neighborhood coffee shop. It was a routine he'd followed for years, a simple pleasure that grounded him despite his complex life as an undercover CIA operative. At 42, he'd mastered the art of blending in, wearing his civilian identity as comfortably as his favorite leather jacket. That ordinary September morning in 2019 would shatter the careful balance he'd maintained between his public and covert lives. As he waited at a red light, police cruisers suddenly surrounded his car, lights flashing and sirens wailing. Through his rearview mirror, he watched officers approach with drawn weapons, their faces set in grim determination. "Get out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." The command boomed through a megaphone, drawing the attention of nearby pedestrians who stopped to watch the scene unfold. Michael's training kicked in. He knew sudden movements could escalate the situation. With deliberate slowness, he raised his hands and stepped out of the car. The cold morning air bit through his thin shirt as he was forced to kneel on the rough asphalt. "Michael Thompson, you're under arrest for armed robbery and assault," an officer announced while roughly handcuffing him. The steel bit into his wrists as confused onlookers recorded the scene on their phones. His mind raced through recent operations, wondering if his cover had been compromised. But this was different, they were accusing him of a crime he knew nothing about. As they read him his rights, he caught fragments of their accusations: a convenience store robbery, an injured clerk, a suspect matching his description. At the police station, Michael maintained his composure despite the hostile stares and rough handling. They fingerprinted him, took his mugshot, and led him to an interrogation room where two detectives waited. The older one, Detective Richards, carried a thick file folder that he slapped onto the metal table. "We've got you dead to rights, Thompson," Richards said, spreading crime scene photos across the table. "Security footage, witness statements, and a victim who picked you out of a lineup. Make it easier on yourself and confess." Michael studied the photos, noting details that didn't add up. The suspect in the grainy security footage shared his height and build, but subtle differences in posture and movement told him it was someone else. Yet he knew claiming his CIA status would only make things worse. Protocol demanded he maintain his cover unless absolutely necessary. "I want my lawyer," he stated firmly, meeting Richard's frustrated glare. The following days blurred together in a county jail cell. His appointed public defender seemed overwhelmed and disinterested, barely glancing at the case files during their brief meetings. Meanwhile, the local media painted him as another violent criminal off the streets, their headlines growing more sensational with each passing day. Michael's neighbors, who'd known him for years as a quiet IT consultant, were interviewed on local news channels. Some expressed shock, while others claimed they'd always suspected something was off about him. The narrative being built around him grew darker by the day. In his cell at night, Michael carefully weighed his options. Revealing his true identity would compromise years of intelligence work and potentially endanger ongoing operations. Yet remaining silent meant facing serious charges for crimes he didn't commit. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of successful undercover work, he was now trapped by a case of mistaken identity. His handler at the CIA remained unreachable through their usual channels, and he knew better than to try explaining his situation to the jail guards. As his arraignment approached, Michael began formulating a plan that would clear his name without completely burning his cover. What troubled him most wasn't the false accusations or the uncomfortable jail cell, it was the realization that this kind of mistake could happen to anyone. He'd seen similar cases during his intelligence work, where rush to judgment and implicit bias led to wrongful convictions. Now he was living it firsthand. The weekend before his arraignment, Michael received an unexpected visitor. A young law student who'd been following his case through local news coverage had noticed inconsistencies in the police timeline. She'd been trying to reach his public defender with her findings, but her calls went unreturned. Her determination to uncover the truth gave Michael his first glimmer of hope since his arrest. Through the thick glass of the visitor's booth, she shared her discoveries. The convenience store robbery had occurred while traffic cameras showed his car across town. The witness descriptions varied wildly, and the lineup procedures seemed questionable at best. But would these facts be enough to overcome the prosecution's narrative? As Michael was led back to his cell that evening, he knew the next few days would determine not just his fate, but potentially the fate of others who might face similar circumstances. His training had prepared him for high-stakes situations, but nothing quite like this, where the truth seemed both his greatest ally and his greatest liability. The morning of his arraignment arrived with a weight of anticipation that hung heavy in the courthouse air. Michael sat in the holding cell adjacent to the courtroom, his prison jumpsuit crisp and uncomfortable. Through the small window, he could hear the shuffle of feet and murmur of voices as the gallery filled with spectators, reporters, and the curious public drawn by the sensational headlines. His public defender rushed in moments before the hearing, looking harried and clutching a messy stack of papers. The prosecution's offering a deal, he whispered hurriedly. Plead guilty to reduced charges, serve 5 years instead of 15. He pushed a document toward Michael, already reaching for a pen. Given the evidence they have, it's the best option. Michael studied his defender's face, noting the signs of a man who'd already decided his client's guilt. No, he said firmly, pushing the papers back. I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do. The defender sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Listen, with your background, the witness identification, and the security footage, we're fighting an uphill battle. The DA's office is pushing hard on this one. They want to make an example. I understand the risks, Michael interrupted, his voice steady. But I'm not taking the deal. The courtroom fell silent as Michael was led in. He scanned the gallery, noting the positions of exits, security personnel, and cameras, habits ingrained from years of fieldwork. In the front row, he spotted the law student who'd visited him, furiously taking notes on a worn laptop. Judge Henderson, a veteran of the bench with sharp eyes and an even sharper reputation, called the court to order. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Wilson, rose with confident swagger, presenting the case against Michael with practiced precision. Your Honor, the state has overwhelming evidence linking the defendant to a violent armed robbery. We have multiple witness identifications, security footage, and physical evidence placing him at the scene. The defendant showed callous disregard for human life when he assaulted the store clerk, who still suffers from his injuries. We request that bail be denied, as the defendant poses a clear danger to society. Michael noticed how Wilson emphasized certain words, painting a picture of violence and danger that bore no resemblance to reality. He also noticed something else, subtle inconsistencies in how the prosecutor presented the timeline of events. When it was the defense's turn, his public defender stumbled through a weak argument for reasonable bail, barely mentioning the contradictory evidence the law student had uncovered. Michael felt his window of opportunity closing. Then, in a moment that would later be replayed on news channels across the country, Michael stood. His defender tugged at his sleeve, trying to get him to sit down, but Michael knew this was his moment to act. Your Honor, I request permission to address the court, he said, his voice clear and confident. Judge Henderson peered at him over her reading glasses. Mr. Thompson, you are represented by counsel. Any statements should come through your attorney. Your Honor, I have information crucial to these proceedings that my counsel is not privy to. Michael maintained eye contact with the judge, projecting calm authority despite his circumstances. The judge studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Proceed, Mr. Thompson, but choose your words carefully. Michael took a deep breath. Your Honor, I need to request a brief recess and the presence of Federal Agent Robert Chen from the CIA's Office of Security. His phone number is classified, but if you'll allow me to write it down. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The prosecutor laughed openly. Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to. Mr. Wilson, Judge Henderson cut him off sharply. I'll remind you that I control my courtroom." She turned back to Michael. "That's quite a claim, Mr. Thompson. Are you prepared for the consequences if you're lying to this court?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'm also prepared for the consequences of revealing this information, which I wouldn't do unless absolutely necessary." Something in Michael's demeanor must have reached the judge. She called both attorneys to the bench for a whispered conference, then announced a 1-hour recess. Michael was led back to the holding cell, where he waited, counting the minutes. 53 minutes later, he heard rapid footsteps approaching. 2 men in dark suits appeared at his cell, accompanied by court security. One was Agent Chen, whom Michael hadn't seen in 3 years. The other was his direct supervisor at the CIA, Deputy Director Phillips. The next few minutes were a flurry of activity. Forms were signed, calls were made, and Michael was quickly ushered into a private conference room. As the door closed behind them, Phillips fixed Michael with a stern look. "You've created quite a situation," Phillips said, his tone carefully neutral. "Years of cover work, potentially compromised." "With respect, sir, I was out of options," Michael replied. "They had the wrong man, and the evidence proving it was being ignored. More importantly, someone set this up, the timing, the location, the witness statements. This wasn't random." Chen and Phillips exchanged glances. "We've been monitoring the situation," Chen admitted. "But protocol required us to maintain distance unless you explicitly requested intervention." "There's something bigger here," Michael pressed. "The robbery, the false witnesses, the rushed prosecution, it's too coordinated. Someone wanted me arrested and rushed through the system before the truth could come out." Phillips nodded slowly. "We've had similar concerns. The operation you were working on before this incident, there were signs of a leak. This might have been an attempt to neutralize you without raising suspicions." As they discussed the implications, Michael could hear movement in the courthouse beyond the conference room. The recess was ending, and soon they would need to return to the courtroom. But now, finally, the real story was beginning to unfold. The question was no longer about proving his innocence, it was about uncovering who had orchestrated this elaborate frame-up, and why they had wanted him silenced. As Michael straightened his jumpsuit and prepared to return to court, he knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. When Michael returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The smugness had vanished from ADA Wilson's face, replaced by barely concealed anxiety as he huddled with his team, whispering frantically. The gallery buzzed with speculation about the mysterious men in suits who had entered the judge's chambers during the recess. Judge Henderson called the court to order, her expression stern. "In light of new information presented to this court, I'm calling a halt to these proceedings." She fixed the prosecution with a piercing stare. "Mr. Wilson, I'm ordering an immediate review of all evidence in this case. And I want to know why certain surveillance footage was not included in the discovery materials." Michael watched as Wilson's face paled. "Your Honor, we weren't aware of any additional footage." "Save it for the investigation," Judge Henderson cut him off. "Mr. Thompson, you're released on your own recognizance. All charges are suspended pending further review." She banged her gavel, but not before adding, "And Mr. Wilson, I want you in my chambers. Now." As Michael changed back into his civilian clothes in the courthouse detention area, he could sense the shift in how the guards treated him, their earlier hostility replaced by awkward professionalism. His belongings were returned quickly, with mumbled apologies for any misunderstanding. Outside the courthouse, Deputy Director Phillips waited in a black SUV with tinted windows. "Get in," he said when Michael approached. "We need to talk somewhere secure." They drove in silence through the city, eventually pulling into an unmarked garage beneath a nondescript office building. Phillips led him to a sparse conference room where Agent Chen and 2 other agents Michael didn't recognize were waiting with laptops and stacks of files. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," Phillips began, closing the door. The operation you were working on before your arrest, monitoring potential domestic terror cells, it went deeper than you knew. We've uncovered evidence of law enforcement infiltration. Michael leaned forward. Corrupt cops? More than that, Chen interjected, spreading photographs across the table. We're looking at a coordinated network inside multiple agencies. They've been using their positions to protect certain groups while framing innocent people to take the fall for their activities. The photos showed familiar faces: Detective Richards, who'd arrested Michael, meeting with known extremist leaders. Another showed Ada Wilson accepting an envelope in a parking garage. The timestamp was 2 days before Michael's arrest. Your arrest wasn't random, Phillips continued. They knew exactly who you were and what you were investigating. This was their way of discrediting you before you could expose them. They figured even if you revealed your CIA status, the damage to your reputation would already be done. The law students' findings about the traffic cameras made more sense now. They got sloppy with the timeline, Michael mused. They were in such a rush to get me off the streets that they missed details. Exactly, Chen nodded. But here's where it gets interesting. He pulled up surveillance footage on his laptop. The convenience store robbery? It actually happened, but not where and when they claimed. Watch this. The video showed a familiar scene, a masked man entering a store, but the timestamp was 3 days before Michael's arrest, and the location was in a different part of the city. More importantly, the suspect's build and movements matched those from the footage used to frame Michael perfectly. They recycled footage from an actual robbery, Chen explained. Digitally altered some details and changed the timestamp. They counted on the confusion and pressure to rush the case through before anyone looked too closely. But why go to all this trouble? Michael asked. Why not just have me disappeared? Phillips grimaced. Because they needed a public arrest. Your investigation was getting close to exposing a pipeline, corrupt officials helping to arm and protect domestic terror cells. They needed to discredit not just you, but any evidence you might have uncovered. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young agent entered with fresh intelligence. The convenience store clerk who'd allegedly identified Michael had just been found dead in his apartment. Initial reports suggested an overdose, but given the circumstances, no one in the room believed it was coincidental. They're tying up loose ends, Michael said grimly. How many other innocent people have they framed like this? Chen pulled up a database on his laptop. We've identified 13 cases in the past year alone with similar patterns. All involving members of minority communities, all rushed through the system with manufactured evidence and pressured witnesses. The question now, Phillips added, is how we proceed. We can't move openly against them without risking the bigger investigation into the terror cells. But we also can't let them continue framing innocent people. Michael studied the evidence spread across the table, his mind racing through possibilities. His CIA training had prepared him for complex operations, but this was different. This wasn't about foreign threats or international espionage, this was corruption in their own backyard, using the very systems meant to protect people to instead destroy lives. What about the law student? Michael asked suddenly. She found inconsistencies in my case without access to any of this intelligence. She could help identify other questionable cases without raising suspicions. Phillips considered this. It could work. A law student investigating potential wrongful convictions wouldn't attract the same attention as a federal investigation. We could feed her information through secure channels, let her be the public face of the investigation. Meanwhile, Chen added, we continue our operation from the shadows, gathering evidence on both the corrupt officials and the terror cells they're protecting. As they formulated their plan, Michael realized that his wrongful arrest, while traumatic, had inadvertently provided them with an opportunity. The corrupt network had revealed their hand, giving the CIA a chance to unravel both the law enforcement conspiracy and the domestic terror threat it was protecting. The next phase would require careful planning and perfect execution. One wrong move could not only compromise the operation but potentially cost more innocent lives. As the team began mapping out their strategy, Michael knew that his experience in jail, though unjust, had given him something invaluable: first-hand knowledge of how the corrupt system operated, and more importantly, how to fight it from within. The next few days moved at a dizzying pace. Michael worked from a secure CIA safehouse, coordinating with the law student, Ashley Parker, who had proved to be an invaluable asset. Her small office at the legal aid clinic had become their public front, while the real operation hummed beneath the surface. "Look at this pattern," Ashley said during one of their secure meetings, spreading case files across the table. She'd been reviewing similar cases from the past 3 years, looking for the corrupt network's fingerprints. "They always move their cases through Judge Reynolds' court, except yours went to Henderson by mistake." Michael studied the documents. "They must have someone in the clerk's office controlling case assignments. When they couldn't get my case redirected to Reynolds, they had to rush their timeline." The evidence was building. Ashley had identified 27 cases with similar patterns: rushed prosecutions, missing evidence, pressured witnesses, and all involving Judge Reynolds. But they needed more than patterns to bring down the network. Late one night, as Michael reviewed surveillance footage, his secure phone buzzed. It was Chen, his voice tense. "We've got movement. Detective Richards just received a large payment through a shell company. Something's coming." Michael pulled up the surveillance feed on his laptop. Richards was meeting with someone in a parking garage, the same figure from previous meetings with known extremist leaders. The audio was garbled, but a few phrases came through clearly: weapons shipment and next week. "They're planning something big," Michael told Chen. "We need to move faster." The next morning brought another breakthrough. Ashley discovered that the convenience store clerk's overdose had been staged. The medical examiner's preliminary report showed signs of forced injection, but the report had been altered before being officially filed. "They have someone in the ME's office too," Ashley said, her voice shaking slightly. "How deep does this go?" Michael noticed her hands trembling as she shuffled the papers. "Are you okay? This isn't what you signed up for when you started looking into my case." She took a deep breath. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But I'm more scared of what happens if no one stops them. Yesterday, I found 3 more cases, all minorities, all convicted on manufactured evidence. One of them has been in prison for 5 years. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from Phillips. "We've got a problem. Judge Reynolds just signed off on releasing 6 high-level suspects on bail. All connected to the terror cells you were investigating." Michael's mind raced. "The weapons shipment Richards mentioned, they're planning to arm these guys as soon as they're out." "Exactly," Phillips confirmed. "We need to move now, but we have to do it right. If we show our hand too early, the whole network will scatter." They formulated a plan. Ashley would continue her public investigation, focusing on Judge Reynolds' pattern of suspicious rulings. Meanwhile, the CIA team would track the released suspects, hoping they would lead them to the weapons cache. But the corrupt network was getting nervous. That evening, Ashley called Michael in a panic. Someone had broken into her apartment, leaving it ransacked. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear: they were watching her. "We need to get you to a safe location," Michael insisted. "No," Ashley countered firmly. "If I disappear now, it'll look suspicious. We need them to think their intimidation tactics are working." Michael admired her courage but insisted on setting up covert surveillance around her apartment and office. He'd already lost one witness to this network, he wouldn't lose another. The next few days were a careful dance of public and covert operations. Ashley continued her legal research, making sure to appear appropriately nervous and cautious. She even leaked some of her findings to a local reporter, carefully selected pieces that wouldn't compromise the bigger investigation. Meanwhile, Michael and Chen's team tracked the released suspects. They observed meetings in abandoned warehouses, mysterious deliveries, and late-night gatherings. The pieces were coming together, but they still needed concrete evidence linking the corrupt officials to the terror cells. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Judge Reynolds' clerks, troubled by what she'd witnessed, reached out to Ashley. She had been keeping her own records, dates, times, and details of suspicious interactions between the judge and certain attorneys. "She's willing to wear a wire," Ashley told Michael during a secure meeting. "Says she has a meeting with Reynolds tomorrow about special handling for upcoming cases." It was a risk, but one they had to take. The clerk was briefed and equipped with a recording device. The next day, she met with Reynolds in his chambers. The recording exceeded their expectations. Reynolds not only discussed the practice of steering specific cases to his court but mentioned the upcoming weapons shipment directly. He needed certain cases cleared from his docket to make room for priorities. But just as they were making progress, things took a dark turn. The clerk missed her next check-in. When agents went to her apartment, they found signs of a struggle and a message written on her mirror: "You're next, Parker." Michael rushed to Ashley's office, arriving just as she was preparing to leave for the day. The street was unusually quiet, and he noticed a van with tinted windows parked across the street. "Don't react," he said quietly as he reached her. "But we need to move. Now." As they headed toward the back exit, Michael's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Chen. The weapons shipment had been moved up. It was happening tonight. They were running out of time, and now they faced an impossible choice: stop the weapons shipment and potentially let the corrupt network escape, or protect their key witness and risk letting dangerous weapons hit the streets. As Michael led Ashley through the darkening streets, he knew that the next few hours would determine not just their fate, but the future of their entire investigation. The corrupt network had shown their desperation, and desperate people were the most dangerous of all. Michael made a split-second decision as they hurried through the darkening streets. He couldn't let the weapons reach their destination, but he also couldn't leave Ashley unprotected. Years of CIA training had taught him that sometimes the best solution wasn't choosing between two bad options, it was creating a third one. "Change of plans," he said, guiding Ashley toward a seemingly abandoned office building. "We're going to use their plan against them." Inside the building, a CIA safe house occupied the entire 5th floor. As they rode the service elevator, Michael contacted Chen. "The clerk's disappearance and the threat to Ashley, they're not just trying to silence witnesses. They're trying to force us to divide our resources. You think it's a diversion?" Chen's voice crackled through the secure line. "They know we're watching them. They're counting on us splitting our team between witness protection and stopping the weapons shipment." Michael's mind raced through possibilities. But what if we let them think it worked? The safe house was a hub of activity when they arrived. Analysts monitored surveillance feeds while field agents coordinated movements. Phillips was there, looking grave. "The clerk is alive," he announced. "They're holding her in a warehouse near the port. Same area where we tracked the weapons shipment." "That's not a coincidence," Ashley said, studying the map on one of the screens. "Look at these buildings. The warehouse district is a maze. Perfect place to split up pursuing agents and pick them off one by one." Michael nodded approvingly. Ashley's legal training had given her an eye for detail that complemented their tactical experience. "They're expecting us to either send a full team to rescue the clerk, leaving the weapons shipment unguarded, or focus on the weapons and abandon our witnesses." "So what's our third option?" Phillips asked. Michael outlined his plan. It was risky, but it might be their only chance to catch both the corrupt officials and the terror cell members in the act. They would make it appear as if their team had split up exactly as the corrupt network expected. "Ashley, I need you to make some noise," Michael said. Call that reporter you've been working with. Tell them you're going into hiding because of threats. Make it dramatic. Ashley caught on quickly. They'll think I'm running scared, drawing their attention away from the clerk. Exactly. Meanwhile, we'll position teams here and here. Michael pointed to locations on the map. Make it look like we're spreading ourselves thin, but actually setting up a perimeter. The next 2 hours were a flurry of controlled chaos. Ashley made her calls, letting emotion color her voice as she told the reporter about the threats and her fear. The story hit local news within minutes. Whistleblower flees after threats. Meanwhile, Chen's team moved into position, deliberately being just visible enough to be spotted by the corrupt network surveillance. They wanted their opponents to think their plan was working. As midnight approached, they picked up chatter suggesting movement at the port. Vehicles approaching the target warehouse, an agent reported. Multiple SUVs and a cargo truck. Through surveillance cameras, they watched Detective Richards arrive with several other corrupt officers. Judge Reynolds was there too, along with ADA Wilson. They were all converging on the warehouse where the clerk was being held. They're getting cocky, Phillips observed. They think they've got us running in circles, so they're all coming to oversee the operation personally. Michael checked his equipment one last time. That's their mistake. Ready? Ashley, who had insisted on staying in the command center despite the risks, handed him a final piece of evidence, a USB drive containing all her research on the corrupt network's previous cases. Be careful, she said. We need you alive to testify about all of this. The operation began at exactly midnight. The first sign that something was wrong came when the corrupt network discovered their communications had been compromised. Their phones went dead, their radios picked up only static, and their escape routes were suddenly blocked by broken-down trucks. Michael moved through the warehouse district's shadows, coordinating with other agents through encrypted channels. They had positioned snipers on nearby rooftops, not to shoot, but to keep anyone from escaping across the rooftops. Inside the target warehouse, Richards and his corrupt officers were growing nervous. Their carefully planned operation was falling apart, but they didn't know why. The weapons shipment had arrived, the clerk was secured, and they thought they had the CIA team scattered and distracted. Everything should have been going according to plan. That's when the lights went out. In the darkness, chaos erupted. The terror cell members, thinking they'd been double-crossed, turned on their corrupt police allies. Judge Reynolds tried to flee but ran straight into a CIA tactical team. ADA Wilson surrendered immediately, already offering to turn state's evidence. Michael found the clerk tied up but unharmed in a back office. As he cut her restraints, he heard Phillips' voice over his earpiece, all targets secured. The weapons never made it off the truck. We got them all. Outside, news vans were already arriving, drawn by tips from Ashley's reporter contact. The sight of corrupt officials and terror cell members being led out in handcuffs would dominate headlines for weeks to come. But the most powerful image came the next morning, when Ashley held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Behind her stood Michael, now publicly acknowledged as a CIA agent, along with the clerk and representatives from every case the corrupt network had manipulated. This isn't just about one conspiracy or one group of corrupt officials, Ashley told the cameras. This is about a system that allowed prejudice and corruption to destroy innocent lives. And it's about the courage of those who stood up to fix it. As she spoke, Michael noticed Detective Richards being led past in handcuffs, the former detective's face ashen as he realized the full scope of what he'd lost. The corrupt network had thought they were smart enough to manipulate the system forever. They never realized that their greatest weakness was believing they were untouchable. The cleanup would take months, reviewing old cases, freeing wrongfully convicted people, rebuilding trust in the justice system. But watching Ashley handle the press conference with grace and determination, Michael knew they had done something more important than just stopping one conspiracy. They had shown that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually come to light. The weeks following the warehouse raid brought a whirlwind of activity that nobody had fully anticipated. What started as a single wrongful arrest had unveiled a scandal that shook the criminal justice system to its core. Michael found himself at the center of a storm that was both professional and deeply personal. In a secured conference room at the Justice Department, Michael sat beside Ashley as they presented their findings to a panel of federal investigators. The evidence was overwhelming: over 50 wrongful convictions, millions in weapons and drug trafficking, and a network of corruption that spread across multiple jurisdictions. The pattern was consistent, Ashley explained, displaying a timeline on the screen. They targeted individuals from minority communities, knowing the system was already biased against them. Then they manufactured evidence, pressured witnesses, and rushed cases through Judge Reynolds' court. One of the investigators, a veteran FBI agent, shook his head in disbelief. And no one noticed this pattern before? People noticed, Michael replied, thinking of the families who had protested outside the courthouse for years. They just weren't listened to. The system wasn't designed to hear them. The investigation expanded like ripples in a pond. Each corrupt case they uncovered led to 3 more. Judge Reynolds' cooperation, secured through a plea deal, proved invaluable. He provided names, dates, and records of every case he had compromised over his 15-year career. But the real work happened away from the federal buildings and press conferences. Michael and Ashley spent long hours in prison visiting rooms, meeting with people who had been wrongfully convicted. Each story was different, yet painfully similar: lives derailed by a system that had been weaponized against them. One case particularly affected Michael. A young man had spent 6 years in prison for a robbery he didn't commit, missing his children's entire early childhood. When they told him he would be released, he didn't celebrate. He just asked quietly, "How do I get back those years with my kids?" The media coverage was intense. Some outlets focused on the sensational aspects: the CIA agent, the weapons trafficking, the corrupt judge. But others dug deeper, examining the systemic issues that had allowed the corruption to flourish. Ashley appeared on several news programs, becoming the public face of the reform movement that grew from the scandal. "This isn't just about catching bad actors," she would explain. "It's about fixing a system that allowed them to operate for so long." Michael's role was more complex. His CIA cover was blown, ending his field operations career, but he found a new purpose in working with federal task forces specialized in rooting out corruption. His experience as both an investigator and a victim of the system gave him unique insight. One morning, as they prepared for another day of testimony, Ashley shared a letter she'd received. It was from a law student in another state who had started reviewing cases in their local courts, inspired by Ashley's example. They weren't alone, similar initiatives were springing up across the country. "You know what this means?" Ashley said, smiling. "They can never go back to business as usual. Too many people are watching now." The corrupt network's trials began that summer. Detective Richards, facing multiple federal charges, attempted to cut a deal by revealing connections to other corrupt officials in neighboring jurisdictions. ADA Wilson had already pleaded guilty, his testimony helping to uncover money laundering operations that had funded the weapon purchases. But the most powerful moments came from the victims of the corruption. Day after day, they took the stand, telling their stories. Mothers who had lost sons to wrongful convictions. Business owners who had been framed when they refused to pay protection money. Communities that had lived in fear of both criminals and the police meant to protect them. Michael testified too, describing his own experience of being framed. His testimony was particularly damaging because he could explain exactly how the corrupt network had operated, having seen it from both sides. "They counted on people's assumptions," he told the court. "They knew that once someone was arrested, many would assume guilt. They exploited our biases and our fear to protect their criminal enterprise. The convictions, when they came, felt like the end of a chapter but not the end of the story. The corrupt officials would serve long sentences, but the work of reforming the system was just beginning. In the fall, Ashley was offered a position heading a new civil rights division focused on reviewing questionable convictions. She accepted on one condition, that they would prioritize cases from communities that had been historically targeted by corrupt officials. Michael found himself increasingly involved in training law enforcement agencies, teaching them to recognize and resist corruption. His classes always started with his own story, how easily an innocent person could be framed, and how difficult it was to prove innocence once the system targeted you. One evening, after a long day of depositions, Michael and Ashley sat in her office, reviewing files for their next batch of cases. The work was far from over, but something had fundamentally changed. "You know what's different now?" Ashley said, looking up from a case file. "People believe us. When we say something's wrong with a case, they actually investigate instead of dismissing it." Michael nodded, thinking of all the people still waiting for justice. "That's because we showed them it could happen to anyone. Even a CIA agent." They had learned that justice wasn't just about catching criminals or winning cases. It was about changing the system that allowed injustice to thrive. The corrupt network they had exposed was gone, but their real legacy would be the reforms and safeguards put in place to prevent it from happening again. As night fell over the city, lights flickered on in office windows where other lawyers and investigators continued similar work. The story of the framed CIA agent had opened many eyes, but it was the ongoing work of dedicated people that would keep them open. The system was changing, slowly but surely, one case at a time. A year after the warehouse raid, Michael stood before a graduating class of law enforcement officers, his presence a stark reminder of how much had changed. The police academy had instituted mandatory ethics training, with his case as a central study in how corruption could infiltrate and poison the system. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty about what other officers did," he told the fresh-faced recruits. "I'm here to show you how to recognize the warning signs, and more importantly, how to have the courage to stand against corruption when you see it." The changes hadn't come easily. There had been resistance from old guard officials who claimed the new oversight measures would make it harder to do their jobs. But the evidence from the corrupt network case had been impossible to ignore, and public pressure had forced meaningful reforms. Ashley's Civil Rights Division had grown into a powerful force for change. They had successfully overturned 37 wrongful convictions in the past year alone, and their methods were being adopted by similar units across the country. But it was the prevention work that gave her the most pride, new procedures that made it harder to rush cases through the system without proper review. One morning, as Michael was reviewing case files in his office at the FBI's new anti-corruption task force, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Officer Rodriguez, a young cop who had been one of Detective Richard's junior partners before the scandal broke. "I need to tell you something," Rodriguez said, clearly nervous. "Something I should have reported a long time ago." What followed was a 3-hour conversation that opened up new avenues of investigation. Rodriguez had witnessed smaller acts of corruption in his early days on the force but had been too intimidated to report them. Now, he was ready to help identify other officers who might have been involved in similar schemes. "What made you come forward now?" Michael asked as their meeting concluded. Rodriguez looked down at his badge. "My daughter asked me the other day if I was one of the good cops or one of the bad ones. I want to be able to give her the right answer." The information Rodriguez provided led to a new phase of the investigation. While the main corrupt network had been dismantled, its influence had spread further than anyone had initially realized. Small groups of corrupt officials had learned from their methods and set up similar operations in other cities. Ashley's team began coordinating with law enforcement agencies nationwide, sharing patterns to watch for and establishing rapid response protocols when corruption was suspected. The goal wasn't just to catch corrupt officials, but to make it harder for corruption to take root in the first place. It's like an immune system, Ashley explained during a national conference on law enforcement reform. Once you know what the infection looks like, you can spot it faster and fight it more effectively. The human cost of corruption remained a constant reminder of why their work mattered. Michael regularly received letters from people who had been wrongfully convicted, their lives forever altered by corrupt officials. Each story strengthened his resolve to continue the fight. One case particularly stood out. A community center director had been framed for drug possession after he started a program to help young people report police misconduct. After his conviction was overturned, he didn't seek revenge or compensation. Instead, he expanded his program to include training for both community members and police officers, creating dialogue where there had once been only suspicion. That's the real victory, Michael told Ashley as they attended the opening of the expanded center. Not just fixing what was broken, but building something better in its place. The media attention had mostly faded, but the work continued. Michael's role had evolved from field operations to something more fundamental, changing the culture that allowed corruption to flourish. He worked with police departments, prosecutors' offices, and judicial review boards, helping them implement new safeguards and accountability measures. Late one evening, as Michael and Ashley were preparing for a major case review, they received news that Judge Reynolds had died in prison. The former judge had been cooperating with investigators until the end, his information helping to prevent other corrupt networks from gaining the foothold his had enjoyed. "It's strange," Ashley said, reading the news alert. He had so much power, but in the end, his most positive impact came from helping to dismantle the system he helped create. The case that had started with Michael's wrongful arrest had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. It wasn't just about catching corrupt officials or overturning wrongful convictions anymore. It was about fundamentally changing how justice was administered. New technology played a role in the reforms. Body cameras became mandatory, with strict penalties for tampering. Case management systems were updated to flag suspicious patterns in arrests and convictions. Anonymous reporting systems made it easier for officers to report corruption without fear of retaliation. But the most important changes were human ones. Police academies now emphasized ethical decision-making as much as tactical training. Prosecutor offices instituted blind review processes to reduce bias. Courts appointed independent monitors to review judicial conduct. Michael's own experience had become a powerful teaching tool. His presentations now included body camera footage from his arrest, showing how easily authority could be abused and how difficult it was to prove innocence once the system turned against you. "The system isn't perfect," he would tell his audiences. "It never will be, because it's run by humans, and humans make mistakes. But we can make it harder for those mistakes to become catastrophes, and we can make it easier to fix them when they do occur." The work was far from over. New challenges emerged regularly: sophisticated corruption schemes, attempts to circumvent oversight, persistent biases that needed to be addressed. But the foundation had been laid for lasting change. As Michael left the police academy that evening, he passed a wall of photos showing graduating classes through the years. The newest classes were noticeably more diverse, a visual representation of the changes taking place. It wasn't just about catching bad actors anymore, it was about creating a justice system that truly served everyone equally. 5 years after his wrongful arrest, Michael stood in front of the newly established Justice Reform Center, a modern building that represented everything they had fought to achieve. The center housed Ashley's expanded Civil Rights Division, training facilities for law enforcement, and a dedicated unit for investigating potential wrongful convictions. Inside his office, the walls displayed photos of the people they'd helped, families reunited after wrongful convictions were overturned, officers who'd stood up against corruption, community leaders who'd worked to rebuild trust between police and their neighborhoods. Each picture told a story of transformation and hope. "We've got something you need to see," Ashley said, entering his office with a thick file. Her role had evolved too. She now headed the National Task Force on Law Enforcement Integrity, her experience with Michael's case having made her one of the country's leading experts on systemic corruption. The file contained data from their 5-year review. The numbers were encouraging. Wrongful convictions had dropped by 60% in jurisdictions that had implemented their reforms. Reports of corruption from within law enforcement had increased, not because there was more corruption, but because officers felt safer reporting it. "Remember when we thought this was just about one corrupt network?" Ashley said, studying the statistics. "We had no idea how much would change." Their work had sparked a national movement. Other cities had adopted their model, creating their own oversight committees and reform programs. The Baltimore model, as it came to be known, was being studied by law enforcement agencies worldwide. That afternoon, Michael had a meeting that brought everything full circle. A young officer had requested to speak with him, the son of one of the men who had been wrongfully convicted during Judge Reynolds' tenure. The father had spent 8 years in prison before being exonerated through their investigation. "I became a cop because of what happened to my father," the young officer explained. "I wanted to be part of the solution." Michael studied the young man's face, seeing in it the same determination he'd seen in Ashley's eyes years ago. "What do you think of the changes we've made?" "They're good," the officer replied thoughtfully. "But there's still work to do. Every time I put on this badge, I think about how it can be used for justice or injustice. It's a choice we make every day." Later that evening, Michael received an urgent call from Chen, who had remained a close ally through the years. A police department in another state had detected patterns similar to those used by the original corrupt network. They wanted Michael and Ashley's team to consult on the investigation. "Some people never learn," Chen said grimly. "They think they can adapt the old playbook for new times." "No," Michael corrected him, "they just haven't learned that the game has changed. The system they're trying to exploit isn't the same one that protected corruption 5 years ago." The next morning, as Michael prepared to leave for the consultation, he stopped by the courthouse where his ordeal had begun. The building looked the same, but everything about how it operated had changed. New safeguards, new procedures, new attitudes, all designed to prevent what had happened to him from happening to others. He thought about Detective Richards, still serving his sentence, and Judge Reynolds, who had died trying to make amends for his crimes. Their actions had caused immense harm, but had ultimately led to positive change. It wasn't justification for what they'd done, but it was something meaningful that had emerged from their corruption. Ashley met him outside the courthouse, ready to head to the airport. "You know what I realized," she said as they walked to the car. "When I first started looking into your case, I thought I was just helping one person. I had no idea we were about to change the entire system." "That's usually how big changes start," Michael replied. "One person sees something wrong and refuses to look away." Their driver for the airport was Officer Rodriguez, now a senior instructor at the police academy. His daughter, the one who had asked if he was a good cop, was now talking about following in his footsteps. "I tell my students about those days," Rodriguez said as they drove. "About how easy it is to look the other way, and how much courage it takes to stand up. But mostly, I tell them about how one case can change everything if you're willing to follow the truth wherever it leads." At the airport, they received news that 3 more wrongful convictions had been overturned in cases linked to their original investigation. The men would be released the next day, returning to families who had never stopped believing in their innocence. "It never gets old, does it?" Ashley said, reading the notification. "Every person freed, every corrupt official caught, every reform implemented, it all matters." Michael thought about his own journey, from CIA operative to wrongfully accused prisoner to catalyst for change. The system hadn't broken him, instead, he had helped break the system that allowed such injustice, helping rebuild something better in its place. As their plane took off, Michael looked down at the city below. Somewhere down there, new recruits were training under new protocols, prosecutors were reviewing cases with new scrutiny, and judges were applying new standards of oversight. The changes they'd fought for were now part of the system's DNA. "You know what the best part is," he said to Ashley as the city faded from view. "We're not done yet. Every case we handle, every reform we implement, every life we touch, it's all part of making sure that justice isn't just a word, but a reality." The plane banked toward their destination, where another department waited for their help. The work would never be truly finished. There would always be those who tried to corrupt the system for their own gain. But now there were people who knew how to fight back, who understood the patterns, and who had the courage to stand up for what was right. Michael's wrongful arrest had started as a tragedy, but it had transformed into something powerful, a catalyst for change that would continue to ripple through the justice system for generations to come. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come from the darkest moments, and that one person's stand for justice could ignite a movement that would change everything.